World of Warfare presents The Battle of the Scheldt. During the fall of 1944, Allied soldiers in the Netherlands faced off against seemingly endless rain in the secluded enclave of the Scheldt River Estuary. But despite the impenetrable fog, the choking mud and heavy enemy fire, the Allies had one clear goal: to secure a robust and adequate supply line to Antwerp Belgium for incoming forces advancing into continental Europe. Against the liberators' efforts and objectives, however, stood almost 86,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, who steadfastly defended their position in the Scheldt without mercy against Allied forces, most of whom belonged to the Canadian Army. Despite the seemingly insurmountable challenges of Mother Nature and enemy resistance, the Canadians continued their advance to liberate the Scheldt River between Belgium and the Netherlands, which represented the most fortified German strongpoint of the Atlantic Wall, which was most pronounced around the island of Walcheren. When the Allies landed at 5 Normandy beachheads on June 6, 1944, among the joint forces were the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade of the 1st Canadian Army. And as the British and American armies broke out of the Normandy pocket for the long push into the German heartland, the 1st Canadian Army was ordered to clear the coastal areas in the Low Countries for the capture of key channel ports, thereby securing a cross-channel supply line in support of the hundreds of thousands of Allied troops now fighting in Western Europe, who in turn pushed eastward toward Belgium along the left flank of the main body of Allied forces. For their part, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division fought their way to the coast, methodically clearing ports of any Nazi resistance before leaving units behind to defend freshly won territory, while the main corps of soldiers continued their advance on Belgium. By early October, key ports such as Boulogne and Dunkirk were firmly in Allied control, while the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had also freed southern England from cross-channel German rocket attacks after they decimated German launch sites along the coast of the continent. At the same time, the 2nd British Army drove into the southern Netherlands, just as British and American airborne divisions attempted a gutsy operation behind German lines in conjunction with Polish allies in Operation Market Garden, with the goal of seizing a bridge over the Rhine River at Arnhem. The brainchild of highly decorated and much beloved British General Bernard Montgomery, the hero of the North African Battle of El Alamein, Operation Market Garden would go down in history as a massive failure, taking the lives of 1,400 men as well as the capture of 6,000 more, thereby ending any hope of a speedy end to the war. In early September, the British had captured Europe's 2nd largest port at Antwerp, Belgium, which at the time had over 28 miles of docks and 600 port cranes. Now the largest port in northwestern Europe after the destruction of Rotterdam in 1940. As winter descended on continental Europe, the Scheldt River became a top priority for the Allies, which was a critical path that connected Antwerp to the North Sea. As long as the Scheldt River Estuary remained under German control, Antwerp would remain an unusable supply route for the Allies' now desperate need for a steady and robust line of resupply. Accordingly, the 2nd Canadian Army was tasked with opening the critical supply route so that the Allied front could continue its advance toward the German heartland. Under the command of General Henry Duncan Graham Crerar, the 1st Canadian Army would go down in history as the largest ever under the control of a solitary Canadian general, which included 175,000 Canadian soldiers and later topped 450,000 troops when they were joined in battle by Allied troops from various British, American, Polish, Belgian, Norwegian, French, and Dutch units. When Greer took ill and was shipped off to England for convalescence, control of the mission was entrusted to fellow countryman Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. The joint forces would first fight for the liberation of the South Beveland Peninsula, north of Antwerp in the province of Zeeland, before storming the island of Walcheren to the northwest. Many historians consider this battlefield area the most difficult terrain that any soldier faced during World War II, made worse when the Germans intentionally blew up dikes that flooded much of the below sea level region. Considered a key strategic point for maritime traffic sailing between Britain and the European mainland since the age of the Roman Empire, the Germans had built massive fortifications along many estuary banks, entrenching heavy guns in partially buried bunkers to make them impermeable to aerial attacks. In total, Walcheren Island was defended by some 86,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, 600 guns and 6,000 vehicles, long before Adolf Hitler and the German High Command identified the vital importance of the region if they were to successfully repel the Allies by denying them a high-throughput supply port, a defensive victory that would surely halt the Allies' advance into the rest of Europe. As early as September 4th, British Admiral Bertram Ramsay had advised the Admiralty, a distracted Montgomery, and the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, of Antwerp's importance. At loggerheads for much of the war in Europe, Monty and Ike's conflict between each other reached its zenith during the Scheldt campaign, when on October 13, Eisenhower was forced to give Monty a direct order, forcing the objecting British commander to finally give the 1st Canadian Army the resources they needed to clear the sea route to Antwerp. In an area that is arguably the strongest concentration of German defenses along the entirety of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a 1,500-mile network of defenses spanning from the border of Spain and France to the northern tip of Norway, the waterways and estuaries of the Scheldt had been densely mined by the Germans, which impeded Allied minesweepers from clearing the body of water. Despite the enormity of the challenge, the first attacks were engaged on September 13th when the 4th Canadian Armored Division attempted to storm the Leopold Canal on its own, ending in a bloody repulse by the Germans. A halt to operations was ordered until the French Channel ports had been completely secured, giving the German 15th Army ample time to add further personnel, weaponry, and fortifications along the banks of the Scheldt. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division proceeded north from Antwerp on October 2nd, while the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 4th Canadian Armored Division would execute a second phase by clearing the Breskens Pocket behind the Leopold Canal during what was dubbed Operation Switchback. As the mission went live, the Canadians and their allies attacked from the south to secure an area between Belgium and the Dutch town of Breskens, pushing up against fierce resistance from well-fortified German positions. Corporal William Bill Davis of the Black Watch Battalion later recalled in a post-war interview that you may find this hard to believe, but it wasn't the fighting that bothered you. You would give your right arm to have a decent night's sleep in a nice, warm, dry place. That became the objective. The Germans were in the way of keeping you from having that. It wasn't the fighting, really, that bothered most people. It was the conditions. It was a terrible, terrible fall and winter in Holland, the worst in more than 50 years. Against all odds, the valorous Canadians eventually broke the enemy's hold on the canal, and though troops and tanks crossed the bridge into the pocket, affording them a small foothold in German territory, more importantly, they had distracted the enemy. Then in mid-October, Canadian troops assaulted the historic Frederick Hendricks Fort, which housed a powerful German battery of coastal and anti-aircraft guns overlooking the waterway. 3 days of bloody combat would follow, until the fort at last fell to the Allies. After a month of fighting, the Allies had removed all German forces from the Breskens Pocket, yet the fighting was far from over, as the Allies set their sights on an amphibious assault of the port of Vlissingen on the opposite side of the inlet, which not only was defended by the Germans, but also the site of a crucial German airfield. Meanwhile, the Allies under the command of Montgomery struggled to secure the entire area, leading Monty to later write in his memoirs, "I must admit a bad mistake on my part. I underestimated the difficulties of opening up the approaches to Antwerp so that we could get free use of that port. I reckoned that the Canadian Army could do it on their own while we were going for the Ruhr, but I was wrong. Walcheren's seaward-facing German defenses were stronger than anything the Allies had encountered back in Normandy, leading to what is now known as Black Friday of October 13th, when Canadian forces fought their way across flooded land and driving rain, not to mention innumerable booby traps and landmines that slowed their progress at a great cost in lives and debilitating injuries, until they successfully captured and defended the dike along a railroad track leading to Vlissingen. The campaign inflicted a significant toll for the Allies, nearly wiping out the 5th Infantry Brigade's Black Watch Battalion, with 58 killed in action, 87 wounded, and 27 men captured. Through waterlogged thick mud and dense fog, the Canadians fought on throughout the remainder of October, spilling into Operation Infatuate, the final stage of the battle, from November 1st through the 8th, when the Allies commenced a coordinated assault by bombers and ground forces that engaged the remaining 10,000 Wehrmacht forces defending Walcheren Island. Before the invasion began, RAF Lancasters and Mosquitoes softened up German positions in and around Vlissingen, while ground troops detonated dikes that raised the water level enough for an amphibious assault on the island by Buffalo amphibious troop carriers. On November 1st, Allied commandos boarded their landing craft and headed for Vlissingen under relentless and heavy artillery fire. At the same time, an Allied tank force approached the port city under an operation codenamed Uncle Beach. As the Allies stormed the city in a fierce display of hand-to-hand street fighting, Vlissingen was liberated on November 3rd, while the entire island was secured 2 days later, as surviving German troops fled across the last bridges available to them along the Scheldt Estuary. With the 4 phases of operations now successfully completed, and the enemy now on the run, mine-clearing operations lasted 3 more weeks before the first Allied convoy entered the port of Antwerp on November 29th, paving the way for an Allied advance into Western Europe. The Battle of the Scheldt proved costly for both sides of the conflict, inflicting 12,000 casualties for the Germans, along with 41,000 men taken as prisoners. The Allies, in turn, suffered 20,873 casualties, including 6,367 for the Canadians, with nearly all the Canadian dead buried at 2 Commonwealth war cemeteries in the area of the battle, where they are still honored annually to this day, making the Battle of the Scheldt an Allied victory that opened the gateway for a drive to the heart of Germany.